Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we dive deep into the human experience, exploring stories of courage, change, and raw emotion. Today's story shines a light on the power of accountability and the courage it takes to stand up against injustice. Join us as we unravel the journey of one man's fight for dignity in a world full of corruption and cruelty. Brookwood, Georgia, a quiet town wrapped in the slow hum of small-town life. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where strangers stand out like sore thumbs, and new faces are met with suspicion. It was here that Danny Jackson, 54, had just stepped into a role he knew all too well, police chief. But unlike the cities he had patrolled, the streets of Brookwood had a certain tension, an undercurrent of hostility. Perhaps it was the isolation, or perhaps it was something deeper, a sense of pride in how the town had kept to itself, unaffected by the noise of the outside world. Danny, a seasoned officer with a career spanning decades, had seen it all. He'd worked in bustling city precincts and dealt with crises of all kinds. But there was something about Brookwood that unsettled him, even from the very first day. Maybe it was the way the local police carried themselves, walking with an air of superiority, as though their badges were more than just symbols of authority. They were shields to protect them from scrutiny. And yet, there was something undeniably broken about the town. Danny could feel it in the air, an energy that didn't sit right with him. That first morning, before he'd even reported for duty, Danny decided to take a walk. He needed to understand the pulse of this place. The sun was barely up, the streets still sleepy with the remnants of night. But there was a cafe in the town square that had already started to stir. The kind of place that looked like it had been around for 100 years, with coffee that smelled like it was brewed by history itself. Danny walked in, an outsider by every definition. His worn cap and faded jacket did little to disguise his presence. The regulars in the cafe had noticed him immediately. Their eyes flicked to him and then quickly away, like he was some kind of disturbance in their routine. At the back of the room, two officers, Jake Turner and Mike Harris, were laughing. Their voices were loud, too loud for the quiet setting. Danny could feel their eyes on him, and though they didn't say a word, the judgment was unmistakable. They were sizing him up, deciding, in that instant, if he was worth their time or if he was just another stranger to be ignored, or worse, pushed around. "Hey, old man, you lost or something?" Jake called from across the room, his voice dripping with mockery. Danny didn't flinch. He played it cool, like he wasn't fazed, just passing through. He replied, his tone casual. Jake's grin widened, and Mike, the bigger of the two, chimed in with his own brand of condescension. "Strangers don't last long around here," he said, making it sound like a warning. Danny, though, didn't take the bait. He didn't come here to fight. He came to learn, to observe. He simply walked out, the weight of their stares on his back. Something told him this would be a more difficult job than he had anticipated. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. The next morning, Danny decided to go for a run. He wasn't a young man anymore, but running had always been a way for him to clear his head, to settle his thoughts. He had no particular destination in mind, just a stretch of road outside of town to feel the rhythm of the earth beneath his feet. The simplicity of movement. It was a peaceful morning, the kind where the world felt still and untouched. But as he jogged along the quiet road, he heard the unmistakable sound of a patrol car pulling up alongside him. It was Jake and Mike again. Their faces, smug and unwelcoming, loomed through the window. "You lost, old man." Jake's voice rang out, taunting. Danny slowed his pace, trying to remain calm. "Just going for a run," he replied evenly, hoping to avoid confrontation. But Mike's next words were laced with something more sinister. "Are you sure you're welcome around here?" Mike asked, his tone thick with menace. Danny's heart rate increased, but he kept his breath steady, his voice calm. "I'm pretty sure it's still allowed," he said, his eyes locking with Jake's, who now stood leaning out of the car window with that smug grin. "Maybe," Jake drawled, "but strangers don't get the warmest welcome around here, especially those who don't know our rules." Danny's brow furrowed. "What rules?" he asked, trying to understand. But before he could say another word, The officers hopped out of the car. They grabbed his arms, yanking him toward the town square. As though they were handling some kind of criminal, there was no explanation, no questions, just an action, a show of force. As they dragged him to the center of town, people started to notice. A few stopped. Curiosity piqued, while others barely glanced up. In the middle of it all stood a large lamp post. And it was here that Jake and Mike decided to make their statement. With dramatic flair, they tied Danny's hands to the post. They made a spectacle of him, like he was some kind of trophy. People gathered around, pulling out their phones, recording the scene as if it were a bizarre, twisted form of entertainment. Jake's voice rang out, mocking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a real big city troublemaker here," he announced, bowing with exaggerated flair. Danny stood there, tied to the pole, surrounded by onlookers who seemed to find amusement in the spectacle. It wasn't just a game for Jake and Mike. It was their way of asserting power, of showing everyone in town that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. As the crowd chuckled and filmed, Danny's mind raced. He was a stranger in their town, but there was something deeply unsettling about how far Jake and Mike were willing to take this. He was just another outsider until he wasn't. The morning dragged on like a slow-moving train, each minute stretching longer than the last. Danny's hands were bound tight to the lamppost. His wrists sore, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that stung. It was the humiliation. Jake and Mike, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, were basking in the attention. They paraded around Danny like he was a sideshow. Their jokes cruel, their voices mocking. The crowd around them had grown, a mixture of curious onlookers and people who had clearly seen this kind of thing before. Some filmed with their phones, capturing every second of the spectacle, while others simply shook their heads, chuckling or muttering under their breath. A few seemed to see through the act, but most just accepted it as part of the town's strange tradition. Danny stood still, his face neutral, though his insides were churning. He could hear Jake's laughter ring out like nails on a chalkboard as he leaned in close, mocking him with every word. "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker," Jake said, making sure the crowd could hear. "Can't have people like you just waltzing in here like you own the place." He shot Danny a sneer, his eyes gleaming with superiority. Mike, playing along, added with a grin, "Yeah, think you can just stroll through our town without paying the price?" The onlookers, in a mix of amusement and apathy, watched Danny struggle silently, bound to the post in full view of the public. He could feel their eyes on him, some with mild curiosity, others with a look of discomfort, but no one did anything. No one spoke up. It was as though they had all decided to turn a blind eye to what was happening. To them, Danny wasn't a man. He was just another outsider being put in his place. "Let's see what else you've got up your sleeves." "Big shot," Jake taunted, pulling out a random scrap of plastic from Danny's pocket. It was something meaningless, something that didn't even belong to him. But Jake held it up like it was evidence of some great crime. "Found something interesting here," he grinned, taunting Danny as though he'd unearthed some dark secret. But Danny didn't flinch. He knew this was a game for them, a twisted power trip, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of showing any sign of weakness. As they stood there, laughing, the rest of the town slowly began to take notice. Some recorded the scene on their phones, while others simply stared in disbelief. No one, it seemed, was willing to step in. This was the way things were in Brookwood. Outsiders were meant to be shown their place, reminded that they didn't belong. The hours passed, and Danny remained tied to the pole, his hands numb, his thoughts racing. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. His whole career had been built on respect, authority, and control. But here, in this town, he was nothing to them. He was just an interloper, a stranger to be humiliated. It was around noon when the story of the mysterious troublemaker tied to the pole began to spread. The local gossip machine had kicked into overdrive. The videos, captured from every angle, began to make their rounds on social media. And before long, local news outlets caught wind of the spectacle. The reporters arrived like vultures, drawn to the controversy like moths to a flame. They pushed their way through the crowd, microphones in hand, looking for a scoop. One of them approached a bystander, hoping to get a comment on the incident. "What did this man do?" the reporter asked. "Did anyone see him commit a crime?" The bystander shrugged, not looking too concerned. "Beats me. Looks like the cops are just having some fun." Danny clenched his jaw, keeping his cool despite the sting of humiliation. This was no longer just about him. It had become a spectacle, a story that people were passing around like the latest gossip. And still, no one stepped in to help. No one challenged the officers. It was as though the power they wielded had been normalized, made acceptable by years of silence and complicity. At the station, Jake and Mike were riding high on their little game. They thought they had won, but they had somehow put the new guy in his place. They laughed and joked in the break room, oblivious to the storm they had set in motion. But the winds were shifting. Danny's phone had been buzzing all morning, but he hadn't answered it. He knew who it was. The higher-ups. They had seen the video, and they weren't happy. By mid-afternoon, the phone call finally came through, his superior from the department. His boss, calling with a voice filled with frustration and concern. "Danny," the voice said, tense with disapproval. "This is a mess. A real mess. The whole thing's gone viral. You need to get in here right now. There are consequences." Danny had known it was only a matter of time before the story reached the higher echelons. The moment the news spread, he knew the game had changed. He couldn't be the chief here and let things slide. Not anymore. As the day wore on, the town square grew quieter. The crowd dispersed, but the sting of what had happened lingered in the air. And for Danny, there was only one thing left to do. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let Jake and Mike get away with it. The next morning, Danny walked into the station, calm and collected. He didn't wear the heavy cloak of anger. Though it burned inside of him, he had a job to do. And today, he wasn't just a new guy. He was the chief. The moment Jake and Mike walked in, laughing and joking, it was clear they had no idea what was coming. They hadn't even bothered to check who Danny really was. To them, he was just another victim of their twisted humor, a man they had humiliated for sport. But the moment they laid eyes on Danny, standing behind the desk, fully dressed in his crisp uniform, their expressions faltered. Their jokes died in their throats. Danny watched them freeze. It was time to remind them who was in charge. The air in the police station crackled with tension as Danny stood in full uniform, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sound of Jake and Mike's voices, once full of bravado and arrogance, had turned into an uncomfortable silence. They were caught, and they knew it. There was nowhere to hide. Danny felt the weight of the moment. He had seen countless situations in his career where authority had been abused. But this was personal. The two officers who had treated him like some kind of joke, tied to a lamppost and paraded for public amusement, had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person in this town who had been silently enduring the abuse and corruption of their own police force. Jake and Mike stood frozen, their eyes darting around the room like cornered animals, their earlier bravado slipping away as reality set in. Danny didn't need to say a word. The coldness in his stance, the stillness of his presence, said everything they needed to know. They had underestimated him. They had thought they were dealing with an outsider, a nobody, someone they could humiliate and control. But they were wrong. The silence in the room stretched. Danny let the tension build, enjoying the feeling of control he'd so rarely experienced in this twisted town. He wanted them to understand the gravity of the situation. He wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, to understand that this was no longer a game. Finally, Danny spoke, his voice steady and calm, though beneath it simmered a quiet rage. "We got ourselves a situation. Gentlemen," he said, his gaze locked onto Jake's and Mike's, who stood frozen in the doorway. "And you're both right in the middle of it." The words hit like a cold slap. The blood drained from Jake's face as he realized what was happening. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some excuse, but Danny silenced him with a raised hand. "Save it, Jake," Danny said, his voice cutting through the room with authority. "I've seen enough to know exactly what's been going on here." Jake stood there, looking around the room as if searching for an escape route. His face, once filled with cocky smirks and arrogance, was now flushed with panic. Mike, who had always followed Jake's lead, stood slightly behind, trying to maintain some semblance of strength. But it was clear he, too, was losing control. Danny took a step forward, the sound of his boots echoing in the quiet room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, hitting play on a video, the very same footage from the previous day, when Jake and Mike had so gleefully humiliated him in public. He held the phone up for everyone in the room to see. For the first time, Jake and Mike saw themselves through the eyes of the others. The laughter, the cruel taunts, the mocking jabs. They saw the video of themselves tying Danny to that lamppost like some kind of trophy, laughing while the crowd jeered, their comments laced with venom. The room fell deathly silent. It was as if the very air had been sucked out, leaving only the weight of their own actions to hang in the balance. "I'm sure there's some confusion," Danny said, his voice now dripping with cold detachment. "For anyone here who doesn't know exactly what's going on, let me explain. These two, Jake and Mike, thought it would be funny to publicly humiliate a man they didn't even bother to get to know. They thought I was just some nobody they could mess with." Danny looked directly at Jake, then at Mike, allowing the full impact of his words to settle in. "You didn't recognize your new chief, did you?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. Jake's eyes widened, a flicker of realization finally crossing his face. It was like a veil lifting, and the horror of his mistake sank in. The room was now thick with the tension of his discovery. His pride, once so bold, had been shattered. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and suffocating. Danny could see the moment Jake and Mike truly understood the depth of their error. It wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about the power dynamics they had abused, the traditions they had upheld at the expense of respect and dignity. And in front of their peers, their fellow officers, they were about to face the consequences. "Look," Jake stammered, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "This is just how things work here. Tradition. You know, we have a little fun with the outsiders. Keeps them in line." Danny's expression remained unchanged. He had heard all the excuses before. "It's just a tradition. We didn't mean anything by it. It's harmless fun." But Danny knew better. This wasn't about tradition. It was about power. It was about creating an atmosphere where the strong could trample on the weak and get away with it. And that kind of thinking had no place in his department. "Tradition?" Danny repeated, his voice colder now. "So you have a tradition of publicly humiliating people because they're new in town? Because they're different? How nice." Jake, perhaps sensing his position was slipping, tried to salvage the situation, but his words faltered. He looked around at the other officers in the room, as if searching for some sign of support, but all he found were uncomfortable glances, eyes diverted, and the weight of the room bearing down on him. Danny turned to the rest of the officers, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I don't know what you all thought was happening here, but it ends now. From this point on, any behavior that disrespects the people in this community will be met with immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances." He let the words hang in the air. "Jake, Mike, hand over your badges," Danny ordered, his voice firm and final. "Your time here is done." The room fell into a stunned silence as the gravity of the moment sunk in. Jake and Mike stood motionless for a few moments before Danny walked toward them. Taking the termination forms from the desk, he handed them over, making it clear that there was no going back. No more jokes, no more games. Their faces were pale now, drained of the arrogance that had once filled them. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they removed their badges from their uniforms, placing them into Danny's outstretched hand. No applause, no cheers, just a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the room. As they left, the air in the station seemed to clear. The weight of their abuse had been lifted, but in its place, something far more powerful had taken root: accountability. But the consequences for Jake and Mike didn't end with their dismissal. In the days that followed, the prosecutor's office launched an investigation into their actions. Complaints poured in from people who had been victimized by their cruelty, people who had stayed silent for far too long. As the truth came to light, the full extent of their actions became clear. The town began to reckon with the reality of what had been happening under their noses. And for Danny, this was just the beginning. He had come to Brookwood to make a difference, to bring justice. And now he had to face the aftermath of that choice. He wasn't just dealing with two rogue officers. He was dealing with a culture that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked for years. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to stop until things had changed for good. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey today. We hope this story has resonated with you, sparking empathy and reflection on the impact of our choices. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Until next time, stay compassionate and always stand for what's right.